The dust had barely settled on the road out of Caldwell, Kansas, before Mabel Wallace realized that the four men behind her were not giving up the way she had prayed they would. It was the summer of 1882, and the prairie stretched out in every direction like a bolt of sun-bleached muslin, endless and hot, and indifferent to the troubles of one woman on a stolen horse. Not that the horse was truly stolen. It was her horse, her chestnut mare named Clover, the one animal in all of Caldwell that had ever belonged solely and completely to Mabel without question or argument. But Harlan Drake had declared otherwise in front of the sheriff's office that morning, and when a man like Harlan Drake declared something, the law in Caldwell had a habit of nodding along. Mabel had not waited to find out how that particular conversation would end. She had pulled Clover from the hitching post outside the dry goods store, checked that her saddlebag held the folded deed to her father's land, the paper that was the whole reason any of this was happening, and she had ridden south before the dust of Drake's proclamation had even settled on the street. That was how the running started. She had made it nearly 2 miles before she heard the hoofbeats behind her. 4 sets of them, hard and deliberate, the kind of rhythm that meant men who knew they were faster and weren't bothering to hide it. She had glanced back once and seen Drake's men, the ones he kept on his payroll for exactly this kind of work, and she had pressed her heels into Clover's sides and asked the mare for everything she had. Clover had answered. The first man had tried to cut her off at the creek crossing south of town, but Mabel had grown up on this land and knew every shallow spot in every waterway for 20 miles. She had taken Clover through a different crossing 300 yards upstream, one so narrow and fast that his larger gelding had refused it twice, and by the time he forced the animal through, she was already gone into the cottonwoods. The second man had been faster and smarter, riding wide around the cottonwood grove rather than through it, trying to get ahead of her and force her to turn back. She had seen him too late and had made a hard decision, cutting east across the open grassland, where there was nothing to hide behind and everything to lose. But Clover was light and the grass was dry, and she had pushed that mare into a dead run that left the second man's horse breathing hard and falling behind. The third man had nearly had her. He had come from the direction she had not been watching, out of a dry wash she had not remembered was there, and his horse had been close enough that she could hear the animal's breath in the thick summer air. But something had happened. His horse had stepped wrong, or stumbled on a rock, or the Lord had simply intervened in the particular way that Mabel had been begging him to all morning, and the man had pulled up short rather than risk a fall, and Mabel had not looked back after that. The fourth man was the one who worried her most. He was the one who knew these plains best, who had ridden for Drake the longest, and he had not tried to run her down the way the others had. He was simply staying with her, patient and steady, not gaining dramatically but not losing ground either, the way a man rides when he believes time is on his side and he has nowhere particular to be. She had been running from that fourth man for the better part of an hour when the rider appeared on the ridge to the west. She nearly missed him entirely, too focused on the ground ahead and the sound behind to lift her eyes toward the skyline, but Clover had shied slightly at something in the periphery, and that small movement had forced Mabel's gaze sideways. There on the crest of the long grassy ridge that ran north to south along the western edge of the open plain, a single horseman sat still against the white sky, watching. She had time for only one thought about him before she had to look forward again to navigate a rough stretch of ground. He was sitting too easy in the saddle to be a threat, the way relaxed men sit when they are not in a hurry and not planning to be. But then everything changed. Because the fourth man behind her made a sound, a short, sharp whistle, the kind that carries meaning between people who have worked together a long time, and the rider on the ridge moved. Mabel's heart seized. She had run 3 of Drake's men off, and she had been so certain she had accounted for all of them, but here was a 5th, positioned perfectly to cut her off, and she had nowhere left to go. North was back toward Caldwell. East was open plain where she had already been run down once and barely escaped. South was where she had been heading, toward her father's old homestead and the next town of any size. But the man on the ridge was moving south now too, angling down off the crest and out onto the plain, and the geometry of it was terrible. She watched him with the corner of her eye, and she made herself breathe, and she thought through every option she had left, which was not many, and she came very close to despair. And then she noticed something strange. The man on the ridge was not angling to intercept her. He was not riding a line that would bring him across her path. He was riding parallel. He was moving south along the same line she was moving, at roughly the same speed, not closing the distance between them but not opening it either. She kept watching him, one eye on the ground and one on that distant rider, waiting for the angle to change, waiting for him to turn toward her. He did not. He rode the ridge line with a loose, easy posture, his horse moving at a comfortable lope, and he was simply going south. The fourth man behind her was still there, still steady, and she could hear him gaining slightly now because she had allowed herself to slow while she puzzled over the man on the ridge. She made a decision that she could not entirely explain even afterward, when she had plenty of time to think about it. She turned west toward the ridge. Not toward the rider directly, not as a surrender or a request for help, but toward the high ground where she could see further and where Clover's footing would be firmer on the grass-covered slope. The fourth man behind her hesitated when she changed direction. She could hear it in the rhythm of his hoofbeats, and that hesitation gave her 50 yards. She was halfway up the slope when the rider on the ridge turned his horse and came toward her, not fast, not aggressive. Just a steady, purposeful walk that brought them together at the crest of the ridge like two roads meeting at a crossroads. He was younger than she had expected. Not young in the way of boys, but young in the way of a man who had not yet been worn smooth by everything the world intended to put him through. He had dark hair under a wide-brimmed brown hat, and his eyes were the particular color of the sky just before dawn, not quite blue and not quite gray, and he was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read because it contained no alarm and no calculation, which made it unusual in her experience. He said, "You have got somebody behind you." "I am aware of that," Mabel said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. "He has been following you for a while." Also aware, he glanced past her at the man in the distance who had slowed now, watching. "You mind if I ask where you are heading?" "South," she said. "San Marcos, or anywhere that is not Caldwell." He considered that for a moment, then nodded as though she had said something reasonable. "I'm heading south myself," he said. "Riding through to meet some cattle near the Cimarron. That man down there know you. He works for a man who wants something I have," Mabel said, "and does not intend to take no as an answer. Most of that kind don't." He turned his horse, putting himself beside her rather than across from her, both of them facing south. "I am not offering to ride with you," he said, and his tone was perfectly matter-of-fact. "I am just going the same direction, but sometimes two people going the same direction cover it faster together than either one does alone." She looked at him sidelong. "That is an interesting way to put it." "It is an honest way," he said. "I am Ralph Easton. I work cattle down along the Cimarron when there is work, and I carry mail sometimes when there is not. I do not work for Harlan Drake, if that is what you are wondering, and I have never particularly liked men who chase women across open country." She was still watching the fourth man in the distance, who had pulled his horse to a complete stop and was now sitting very still, looking up at the ridge. She understood the calculation he was making. One woman alone was one thing. One woman with a man beside her, even a stranger, was a different problem, particularly when the man beside her sat in the saddle the way Ralph Easton did, which was with the easy authority of someone who had not had any trouble of that kind in a while and did not expect to start now. "Mabel Wallace," she said, "and I did not say I needed company." "No," Ralph said. "You did not." He touched the brim of his hat. "I am heading south." He started forward, and she watched him go for 3 full seconds. which was about as long as she could afford with a man still sitting on his horse a quarter-mile behind her, and then she put Clover into a trot and followed. They rode for 20 minutes without speaking, which Mabel found either restful or suspicious depending on which part of her mind she consulted. The man behind them had not followed past the ridge, and she had checked 4 times to be certain. The open country ahead was golden in the late morning light, the grass moving in long, slow waves under a wind that carried the smell of dry earth and something faintly sweet that she could not identify. "How far to San Marcos?" she asked eventually. "Day and a half at a comfortable pace," Ralph said. "Less if you push." "Can we push?" He glanced at her mare with the appraising eye of someone who knew horses well. "How hard have you been running her this morning?" "Hard enough." "Then we should give her an hour easy before we ask for more." He looked forward again. "There is a creek about 3 miles ahead with decent shade. We can water the horses and eat something if you have it. I have biscuits and salt pork if you do not." She had nothing. She had left the dry goods store with the deed in her bag and Clover under her, and approximately no other preparation for what had turned into a full flight across the Kansas plain. She would not say this, she decided, because she had already told this stranger her name and her destination, and she was not interested in also telling him how thoroughly unprepared she was. "Biscuits and salt pork," she said. "That will do." They found the creek exactly where he said it would be, tucked into a shallow cut between 2 low banks of dark earth, shaded by 3 large cottonwoods that were old enough to have thick knotted trunks. The water ran clear over a sandy bottom and Clover went to it gratefully, and Ralph's horse, a tall bay with a white blaze that he called Drum, went in beside her without any fuss. Ralph tied both horses loosely to a low branch where they could reach the water, and then pulled his saddlebag off and produced exactly what he had promised: 3 biscuits wrapped in a cloth and a piece of salt pork that had been cooked at some earlier point and sliced thin. He handed her half without ceremony and sat down on the bank with his back to one of the cottonwood trunks, his hat off for the first time, and she could see his face fully in the dappled light under the trees. He was not handsome in the way of men who know they are handsome and use it. He was handsome in the quieter way, the kind that takes a moment to register, because it is in the structure of the face rather than any deliberate presentation of it. His jaw had the beginning of a beard that was clearly not intentional, but simply the result of days on the road, and there was a scar along his left cheekbone that was old enough to have gone silver, and his hands, when he broke his portion of the biscuit, were calloused in the exact places that spoke of sustained hard work. He was 25, she would learn later. She was 22. Neither of them knew the other's age yet, and neither asked. "What is in Caldwell that wants you gone so badly?" he asked. He did not look at her when he asked it, watching the horses instead, which made it feel less like interrogation and more like conversation, and she found herself answering before she had fully decided to. "My father died 8 months ago," she said. "He left me his land, 160 acres north of town, which is good grass land, and Harlan Drake has wanted it for years. While my father was alive, Drake made offers and my father refused them. When my father died, Drake went to the territorial court and filed a claim saying the deed was fraudulent and the land should revert to open territory, which he would then claim first rights on." She paused. He had a judge in his pocket who was willing to find in his favor. The hearing was set for yesterday. "Yesterday," Ralph said. "I found a copy of the original land grant in my father's things 3 weeks ago. A federal land grant registered in 1867, before Caldwell was even a proper town. Drake's claim cannot stand against a federal grant. But the judge Drake owns would have ignored it anyway, so I needed to get the document to the federal land office in San Marcos before Drake's ruling became final." Ralph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And Drake figured out what you were doing. He has a man who watches the post road. I think he saw me looking at the documents in town. He came to the sheriff this morning and declared that I had stolen my own horse." She looked down at the biscuit in her hand. The sheriff in Caldwell does not require much of a reason to side with Harlan Drake. No, Ralph said. I imagine he does not. He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands, looking at it. How long ago did your father pass? She had not expected him to ask that, and the unexpectedness of it put a small crack in the composure she had been maintaining since early morning. 8 months, she said. November last year. I am sorry for that, Ralph said. And then he did not say anything else about it, which was exactly right, because she did not want sympathy to run on, and she did not want the feelings it produced to get loose in the middle of a day when she needed to be sharp and certain. Thank you, she said. They ate in silence after that, and it was a comfortable silence, which struck her as strange given that she had known this man for approximately 1 hour and had not been planning to know him at all. When the horses were rested and the water was finished and the cloth that had held the biscuits was folded back into his saddlebag, they rode south. The afternoon moved slowly around them. The light went from white to gold to the particular amber that preceded the long Kansas sunset, and the land around them shifted from open grassland to rougher country, low breaks and rocky outcroppings, the beginning of the transition from the flat top of the state down toward the Oklahoma territory line. The air cooled marginally as the sun dropped and carried more smell of sage and dust. Ralph rode well. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, which was closely and without comment, because she had learned early that what you noticed quietly was more useful than what you said aloud. He did not waste movement in the saddle. He read the ground ahead of him without seeming to look at it, small adjustments in direction that kept Drum moving comfortably over terrain that a less attentive rider would have taken harder. He held his reins with a light hand, and his horse responded to it, which told her something about patience, because horses that answered to light hands were horses that had been taught by someone who did not hurry the lessons. She caught herself watching him more than was strictly necessary for navigation purposes and redirected her attention to the horizon. You said you carry mail sometimes, she said, when the silence had stretched long enough that conversation felt natural again. What county? Whatever county needs it, Ralph said. It is irregular work. There are routes that the regular carriers do not cover out in the rough country where the ranches are scattered. I pick up the bags in whatever town I am passing through and deliver what I can and bring back what needs returning. He paused. It pays a little. It gives me a reason to know the country. You prefer knowing the country to staying in one place. He considered this more seriously than she had expected. I prefer knowing the country, he said slowly. I am not sure yet whether I prefer being nowhere in particular. Sometimes I think I am still looking for the place I want to be. He glanced at her. Does that sound like nonsense? No, she said honestly. It sounds like someone who has not found what he is looking for. That is probably accurate. He turned forward again. What about you? If the land is saved, what then? Do you work it yourself? I have been working it myself for the past year, she said. My father was ill for a long time before he died. I kept the cattle fed and the fence lines maintained and the house from falling down. There is not much about running that piece of land that I do not already know how to do. She said it without bravado, simply as a statement of fact, and he received it the same way. How many head? 32. I sold some last fall to cover the winter. I'm hoping to build back up in the spring. What kind? Longhorn crosses mostly. Hardy animals. They do fine on that grass. He nodded. Good country for it. They made camp that night beside a dry wash where a line of scrubby cedars gave enough shelter to feel less exposed than the open plain. Ralph made a small fire and put coffee on, which was the first coffee Mabel had had since early morning, and which she received with more gratitude than she wanted to show. He fried more salt pork and made a simple pan bread from flour and water and a little lard that he carried in a small tin, and the result was plain and hot, and she ate it with the kind of appetite that comes from having been frightened and exhausted for a full day. The fire made a small, warm circle in the darkness. Beyond it, the Kansas night pressed in close and enormous, full of stars and the low singing of insects, and the distant call of something she could not identify. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ralph said. She looked at him across the fire. "You can ask. Were you frightened today, running from those men?" She thought about answering the expected way, which was to say no, of course not, she had handled worse. But there was something in the way he asked it, not with the tone of a man who wanted to be impressed or reassured, but with the tone of a man who was genuinely curious about the truth, that made the expected answer feel insufficient. "Yes," she said. "When the fourth man would not fall back, I was frightened. The first three made mistakes, and I knew I could use those mistakes. The fourth man was patient, and patience is harder to outrun than speed." She paused. "What made you stop on that ridge?" "I heard riders before I saw them," he said. "Somebody running and somebody chasing. It is not the kind of sound that has a pleasant explanation." He looked at the fire. "I have seen what men like that do when they catch someone who does not want to be caught. I did not want to keep riding south and carry that with me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Most men would have kept riding," she said. "Most men would have told themselves it was not their business." "It became my business when I stopped," Ralph said simply. "And I did not stop to rescue you. I stopped because I could not keep going the other direction." She did not have a response for that, and she did not try to manufacture one. She drank her coffee, and the fire settled, and the stars above were extraordinary in the way that stars are only extraordinary when you are out in open country with no town light for miles in any direction. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not chasing me." He looked up from the fire. "I was never chasing you," he said. "I was riding the same direction." She smiled at that. It was the first time she had smiled all day, and it felt like something loosening in her chest, a knot that had been pulled tight since she had seen those men behind her that morning. "That is a very specific distinction," she said. "It is," he agreed. And there was something in his voice when he said it, warm and quietly amused and directed entirely at her, that made the night feel different from any other night she could currently recall. They kept watch in turns, he first and she second, and neither of them slept particularly well, though the night passed without incident. When morning came, it came fast and golden out of the east, the way Kansas mornings did in summer, and Mabel woke with her back stiff and her hair loose from its pins, and Ralph already up and the coffee already on. She fixed her hair with her back to him, coiling it and securing it with the pins she had managed not to lose, and when she turned around he was looking at the horizon and not at her, which she appreciated. "Day 2, he said, and handed her the coffee. "Day 2, she agreed. "How far?" 8 to 10 hours of riding. We should be in San Marcos before dark if we do not stop long." "Then we do not stop long." They rode harder that day, because the urgency of what she was carrying pressed more heavily now that they were close to the end of it. She explained more of it as they rode, because there was nothing else to do, and because talking kept her mind from turning over the possibility that Drake had already gotten word ahead of them, that he had some faster road she didn't know about, that the federal land office would be closed or unwilling or compromised the way the territorial court had been. Ralph listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "The federal land office in San Marcos is run by a man named Chester Briggs. He has been there since '74, and he is not the kind of man who takes money from people like Drake. He is thorough, and he is slow, and he is honest. If your document is what you say it is, he will see it registered." She turned to look at him. "You know him. I have delivered mail to that office for 3 years. Chester Briggs has never once asked me to hold a letter or redirect a parcel. The man's desk is the cleanest government desk I have ever seen." He glanced at her. "He will help you." She let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding. "You are certain?" "I am certain about Chester Briggs," Ralph said. "I am less certain about the rest of it, but one step at a time." They stopped at noon beside a water tank that served a small ranch operation, the owner of which was a weathered woman named Mrs. Tanner, who came out onto her porch with a shotgun when she heard them approach and put it down when she saw they were not Drake's men or anyone else she needed to shoot. Mrs. Tanner filled their canteens from the pump without being asked and gave Mabel a piece of corn bread without any particular ceremony and said, "You two passing through," in the tone of someone who knew they were but wanted to hear it confirmed. "San Marcos," Ralph said. "Today, if the horses hold." Mrs. Tanner looked at the horses. "They'll hold," she said with the authority of someone who had been looking at horses in this country for many years. She looked at Mabel more carefully, the way older women sometimes did, reading something in her face that Mabel was not sure she meant to show. "You got trouble behind you, girl." "I had trouble behind me," Mabel said. "I believe I am ahead of it for now." Mrs. Tanner made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite doubt. She looked at Ralph. "You looking after her?" "We are looking after each other," Mabel said before Ralph could answer. She said it crisply and without apology, and Mrs. Tanner gave a short nod that contained something that might have been respect. "Good answer," Mrs. Tanner said. "Get on, then. You have got hours yet." They rode the rest of the afternoon without trouble, the country gradually becoming more settled as they moved south, more evidence of human presence in the form of fenced pastures and occasional buildings, and the distant threat of smoke from ranch chimneys. The road improved and the ground leveled out again, and San Marcos appeared in the late afternoon as a cluster of buildings on a low rise, catching the western light. Mabel looked at it from a mile out and felt something enormous settle in her chest. She had made it. Whatever happened next, she had made it to the place where the thing could be done. "There it is," Ralph said. "There it is," she agreed. Her voice was unsteady for the first time since the previous morning, and she did not fight it. He looked at her once, and in that look was something she could feel but could not yet name, warm and attentive and entirely without condition. Then he looked back at the road and said, "Let's go finish this." Chester Briggs was exactly what Ralph had promised. He was a small, precise man of perhaps 55. With spectacles on a chain and ink on 2 of his fingers and a desk that was, as advertised, immaculate. He received the land grant from Mabel with both hands, like it deserved careful handling, and he put it under a magnifying glass and compared it against 3 different reference documents that he retrieved from a locked cabinet, and he asked her 4 specific questions about her father's name and the year of filing and the original parcel designation. And when she answered all 4 correctly, he set the magnifying glass down and said, "This is legitimate." "Yes," Mabel said, "it is. And there is a territorial court ruling you are contesting, filed 2 days ago in favor of a man named Harlan Drake, void on its face because the federal grant predates any territorial claim." Briggs looked at the document again. He looked at Ralph, who was standing near the door with his hat in his hands. "You vouching for this?" he asked. "I am vouching for her," Ralph said, "which means the same thing." Briggs made a sound that was possibly the nearest he came to warmth and said, "Sit down, Miss Wallace. This will take about an hour to register properly. I will not rush it because rushed registrations have errors, and errors are what lawyers live on." He looked at her over his spectacles. "When I am done, you will have a certified copy of this grant with the official federal mark, and the territorial court's ruling will be worth approximately the paper it is written on." Mabel sat down. Ralph sat beside her. Outside, San Marcos went about its evening business, the sounds of a working cattle town drifting through the windows, horses and voices, and somewhere a piano starting up in what was probably the saloon. The oil lamp on Briggs's desk made a warm circle of light, and the pen scratched steadily across the registration forms, and the clock on the wall moved in the particular slow way of clocks in official places. At some point during the hour, without either of them making a decision about it, Ralph's hand and Mabel's hand came to rest on the arms of their chairs in such a way that their knuckles were nearly touching. Not touching, but nearly. And neither of them moved away. Briggs handed her the certified copy at 7:45 in the evening and said, "Keep this separate from the original, and if I were you I would send a copy to an attorney in Topeka as well, just to have it in 3 places." He paused. "Drake will contest this." "I know," Mabel said. "He will lose," Briggs said. "Federal supersedes territorial. There is no question about that law, but he will make it unpleasant for a while before he accepts the loss. I am accustomed to unpleasant, Mabel said. Briggs looked at her with those careful eyes above the spectacles. I believe you, he said. He stood and offered his hand, and she shook it. He offered his hand to Ralph, and Ralph shook it. Good evening, both of you. Outside on the street, the evening air had finally cooled to something bearable, and the sky in the west was the deep red of late summer sunsets, the color that always made the world look briefly like it was on fire in the most beautiful way. Mabel stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of Briggs's office with the certified copy of her land grant held in both hands, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 8 months, to feel something approaching safety. She did not cry. She was not that kind of woman, or she had not been for a long time, since learning that crying in front of men gave them an idea of where your soft places were, and most men would find those places again when they needed leverage. But her throat was tight and her eyes were warm, and she looked at the red sky for a long time without speaking. Ralph stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from his arm. He did not say anything. He did not try to make the moment into something it was not or fill it with words it did not need. He simply stood there, present and steady, the way he had been steady all day, and she found that his steadiness was something she had been leaning on without fully acknowledging it. I need to eat something that is not biscuits and salt pork, she said finally. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, a real one, open and genuine, and it was a good laugh, the kind that makes the person next to you want to produce it again. There is a restaurant on the main street, he said. I have eaten there before. The steak is decent. Then we are going to eat a decent steak, she said, and you are going to let me pay for it because you have fed me for 2 days. He looked like he was going to argue this, and she gave him a look that she had learned from her father, the one that said the decision was already made and the argument was going to be a waste of everyone's time. All right, he said. The restaurant was warm and not too crowded at this hour. The dinner rush mostly finished, and the woman who ran it seated them at a table near the window with a candle between them and menus that Mabel read with the focused attention she gave to anything that might result in food. She ordered the steak as promised, and Ralph ordered the same, and they sat in the candle light with their coffee coming first and the noise of the town outside the glass. Now that the urgency of the day was past, she noticed things she had not had space to notice on the road. She noticed that he was careful not to take up more of the table than his share. She noticed that he asked the woman who brought their coffee if she needed anything rather than just thanking her, a small instinctive courtesy that many men would not have thought of. She noticed that he sat at an angle to the chair rather than square to it, like someone who has spent more time outdoors than in, who is not yet entirely comfortable with walls and ceilings. She noticed that when she was talking, he watched her face with the kind of attention that implied everything she was saying mattered to him. She found this profoundly unsettling in a way she could not immediately explain. How long have you been on the road? She asked. This particular ride, 5 days north from the Cimarron, but in general coming up on 3 years. 3 years since what? He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Since my family's place in Missouri sold. After my father died, there were debts we did not know about, and the land had to go to settle them. My mother went to live with my sister in St. Louis. And I had nothing to go back to Missouri for, so I kept going west. She heard the echo of something familiar in that, the particular flatness that comes into a person's voice when they are describing a loss they have made peace with but have not forgotten. How long ago was your father? 3 years and 4 months ago, he said. I know that precisely because it was the same week the cattle drive I was working finished, and I rode home to find the creditors already at the house. He looked at the candle. He was a good man. He just trusted the wrong people with borrowed money. My father trusted the right people with everything, Mabel said, and it still nearly wasn't enough. Nearly, Ralph said. He looked up at her. You said nearly. Because of you, she said. Not as a compliment, not with any false warmth, but simply and directly the way she said things. If you had not been on that ridge when you were, I do not know that I would have lost the fourth man. He was very patient. Ralph was quiet for a moment. I think you would have found a way, he said. You had already lost 3 of them. The fourth one was going to run me out of daylight, she said. I know it. He nodded slowly, accepting this, and she appreciated that he did not argue her own assessment of her own situation. The stakes came, and they were indeed decent, and the meal that followed was one of those meals that belongs to a specific kind of relief, the relief of having been in danger and being no longer in danger, of having been hungry and being no longer hungry, of being warm and fed, and in the company of someone whose presence has become, over 48 hours, unexpectedly necessary. She thought about that word as she cut her steak. Necessary. It was a strong word, and she was a careful woman with words, especially strong ones. She filed it away to consider later in the privacy of her own thinking. What happens when you go back to Caldwell? Ralph asked. I present the certified copy to the territorial court and demand the ruling be set aside. I have enough for an attorney, barely. I sold 2 steers in April that I had been keeping back for exactly this kind of emergency, though I had hoped not to use them. She paused. Drake will make it unpleasant for a while, as Briggs said. He has money and connections and the habit of winning. But the law is the law, and this particular law is federal and very clear, and eventually he will have to accept it. And after that, if it all holds, then I have 160 acres and 32 cattle and a house that needs a new roof on the east side, and I will build it back the way my father built it the first time. She said this without wistfulness, as a plan, a series of steps to be taken. I know how to do it. I just need to be allowed to do it without someone trying to take it from me. You should be allowed, Ralph said. It sounded like he meant something more by it than the words alone carried. Something about the injustice of the whole thing. A woman having to run for her own life to keep what was rightfully hers. Having to outrun 4 men just to access a legal system that should have protected her in the first place. He said it with a quiet edge that told her he understood what it meant, what had been done to her and her father and the land, and that he found it wrong in the deep way, the way that makes a person's jaw tighten slightly. She looked at him in the candle light. Yes, she said, I should be. They stayed at separate lodgings that night, the hotel having 2 rooms available, and Mabel slept in a real bed for the first time in 2 days, and slept so thoroughly that she did not move from the position she fell asleep in until the morning light came through the curtain. When she came downstairs, Ralph was in the dining room with coffee and a newspaper, and he looked up when she came in with an expression that was careful and warm and slightly uncertain in a way she found she liked. Good morning, she said. Good morning, he said. Did you sleep? Extremely well. She sat across from him. You, also well. He set the paper down. I have been thinking. About what? He looked at the table, then at her. About the road back to Caldwell. If Drake knows you are in San Marcos, and he likely does by now, he may have men watching the road north. I know a longer way that comes into Caldwell from the east. It adds 4 or 5 hours, but it avoids the main road entirely. He paused. I was thinking I might ride with you, same direction and all. She looked at him steadily. You said you had cattle to meet on the Cimarron. In 4 days, he said. I have time. She knew she should say no. She was accustomed to her own company on the road, and she had managed the crisis that had required his presence, and she did not need an escort and did not want to be the kind of woman who required one. She had run 4 men off with her own wit and Clover's legs before he had appeared on that ridge, and she was entirely capable of riding back to Caldwell under her own power. All of that was true. Also true was the fact that when he had been sitting beside her at Briggs's desk, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm, she had felt safer than she had felt in 8 months, and that was a thing she wanted to examine more carefully before she let it go. Same direction, she said. He smiled, and it changed his face in a way she had not fully seen before, making it younger and lighter, and she thought that this man probably did not smile like that very often, and that it was a very good smile. Same direction, he agreed. They left San Marcos mid-morning, taking a route that Ralph knew from mail runs, heading east first and then looping north on a series of ranch roads and cattle tracks that avoided the main post road entirely. It was rougher going and slower, but the country was beautiful in a stark way that the main road, with its ruts and its traffic, did not offer. Rolling prairie broken by rocky draws and stands of wild plum, and the occasional breathtaking view from a high point that showed the plains stretching north for what felt like forever. They talked all day. This surprised her, because she was not generally a woman who talked all day to anyone. She had grown up relatively isolated, the daughter of a man who was warm but not loquacious, and she had learned to be comfortable with silence and to distrust people who could not tolerate it. But talking with Ralph was not the filling silence kind of talking. It was the discovering someone kind, where one question leads to another and each answer opens up a new direction, and the conversation has its own internal momentum that neither person is particularly steering. She learned that he had two sisters, both older, both married, one in St. Louis and one in Springfield. That he had ridden a cattle drive at 17 and had been hired for the next one at 16, which is how she knew he had been 17. That he could read and had brought a book in his saddlebag, which was Roughing It by Mark Twain, which he had been reading for 3 months because he only managed a few pages at a time. That he did not drink whiskey, not from principle, but because it made him ill in a way that was embarrassingly immediate. That he had once spent 2 weeks snowed into a lined shack on the Nebraska prairie with a man named Cobb who played harmonica badly, and that he still flinched sometimes at the sound of harmonica music. She told him things too, more than she usually did. That she had learned to ride before she learned to walk, according to her father, which she suspected was an exaggeration but not by much. That she had attended school until she was 15, when her mother died and she had stayed home to help her father, and that she missed the reading most of all and had made up for it by ordering books through the mail whenever she had money to spare. That she had been engaged to a man once, briefly, 2 years ago, a young farmer named Thomas who had been kind but who had wanted her to sell her father's land and move to his county, which she had been unwilling to do, and they had agreed without much drama to go their separate ways. That she could cook tolerably but not well, and that she was a better ranch hand than she was a housekeeper, and that this had not bothered her until recently when she had begun to understand it might bother other people. Ralph had said, at that last part, it should not bother other people. And she had said, no, but it does. And he had said, then those are the wrong people. They stopped in the late afternoon at the edge of a small creek to rest the horses, and Mabel got down and walked to the water's edge and stood looking at the reflection of the sky in it, which was turning pink and orange as the sun angled lower. She heard Ralph come up beside her and they stood that way for a moment, not talking, looking at the reflected sky. Can I tell you something? He said. You have been telling me things all day, she said. This is different. He paused. When I saw you on that plane yesterday morning running, I thought you were the most capable person I had ever seen. And then when I got close enough to see your face properly, I thought. He stopped. You thought what? She asked. Her voice came out quiet. I thought that I would very much like to know you, he said. That is all. I just want you to know that. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the water, not at her, which she recognized as his way of offering her something without pressing it on her, and she stood there in the pink evening light looking at his profile and feeling the knot in her chest come further loose. You are already knowing me, she said. You have been for 2 days. He turned then and looked at her directly, and in that look was everything he had just said and more besides, and she did not look away from it. I would like to keep doing it, he said. She thought about all the reasons why this was impractical. She had a ranch to save, and cattle to feed, and Drake to fight, and a roof to fix. And this man had cattle to meet on the Cimarron in 4 days, and after that, who knew what direction he would go. She thought about Thomas, who had been good and kind and still wrong, and about the general principle that she had built her life around her own competence and her own direction, and she was not interested in changing that. And then she thought about his hand not quite touching hers at Briggs's desk, and the way he had laughed at her comment about the biscuits, and the fact that in 48 of the hardest hours she had recently experienced his presence had made every single one of those hours more bearable. "Then keep doing it," she said. They camped again that night, and the following day they rode the last miles into the northern approach to Caldwell, coming in from the east as Ralph had planned, and they did not see any of Drake's men on the road, which either meant that Drake had not anticipated this route or meant that his men had given up watching. They came into Caldwell in the early afternoon of the third day since she had left it. The town looked the same as it always did, dust and activity, and the permanent smell of cattle and horses, the wide main street with its mixture of prosperous storefronts and rougher establishments, the church at one end and the saloon at the other, the sheriff's office in the middle where it could see both without taking sides in any official capacity. She rode straight to the office of the town's one attorney, a man named Sutton who had a practice on the second floor above the millinery. Sutton was not the most brilliant lawyer she had ever encountered, which was admittedly a limited sample, but he was honest, and he was sufficiently knowledgeable about land law to understand immediately what she had in her hands when she laid the certified copy on his desk. "Federal grant," he said, looking at it. "Registered in 1867, Mabel said. Chester Briggs certified it at the San Marcos Land Office 2 days ago." Sutton sat back in his chair and looked at her over the tops of his fingers. "Drake is going to come at you hard," he said. "I know. This will hold," he said, "but it will take several weeks to work through the court process. Drake will file objections and we will answer them, and eventually the territorial court will have to concede. I want you to understand that this is not over today." "It will hold," Mabel said. "It will hold," Sutton agreed, "provided you keep that original document safe." "Where is it?" She tapped the saddlebag on her shoulder. "On my person. Keep it there or somewhere equally safe. Do not let it out of your control." He looked at Ralph, who was standing near the door again in his habitual position. "Who is this?" "Ralph Easton," Ralph said. "I have been traveling with Miss Wallace from San Marcos. I am available as a witness to the certification process if that is useful." Sutton looked at him assessingly. "It might be. Can you stay in Caldwell a few days?" Ralph looked at Mabel. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment, but something passed between them that was its own kind of conversation. "A few days," Ralph said. Sutton filed the petition to set aside Drake's ruling the following morning, and by noon of that day the news had moved through Caldwell the way news in a small town moves, which is to say in every direction simultaneously. Mabel was aware of it in the changed quality of people's behavior toward her, the looks she got on the street, some approving and some cautious and some simply curious, and one from Harlan Drake himself, who she encountered outside the bank at 3 in the afternoon. Drake was a large man, heavy in the prosperous way, with a face that had learned over many years how to look reasonable while saying unreasonable things. He stopped in front of her on the wooden sidewalk, and she stopped too, because she would not step around him like she was afraid of him, and they looked at each other for a moment in the full afternoon light. "Miss Wallace," he said. "Mr. Drake," she said. He looked at the saddlebag on her shoulder. "I suppose you are feeling very clever right now." "I am feeling within my legal rights," she said, "which is all I ever wanted to feel." Drake's jaw worked for a moment. He was used to winning, she could see it in his face, the particular frustration of a man for whom obstacles were things that other people removed. "This is not over," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not, but it is going the right direction." She stepped around him then because she had said what needed saying and there was nothing else that needed to happen on this sidewalk, and she walked down the street with her spine very straight, and the saddlebag solid on her shoulder and her heart hammering in a way she kept very carefully off her face. Ralph fell into step beside her from where he had been watching from across the street. He said nothing about it. He just matched her pace. "How did that look?" she asked, from the corner of her mouth. "It looked exactly right," he said. She breathed out, "Good." Over the next week, which was the week Ralph stayed in Caldwell while Sutton worked through the preliminary legal process, several things happened. The territorial court issued a temporary stay of Drake's ruling pending review of the federal certification. Sutton received a letter from a Topeka attorney confirming that the federal grant was registered in the state records as well, giving them a second anchor. Drake's lawyer filed 2 objections that Sutton described as creative but ultimately toothless. And Mabel went back to her father's land for the first time in 3 days and found it exactly as she had left it, which was to say slightly worn but fundamentally intact. And Ralph Easton, in the week he stayed in Caldwell before his obligation at the Cimarron required him to leave, became someone that Mabel could not easily imagine the days without. He helped her fix the fence line on the east pasture, not because she asked him to, but because he had ridden out with her one afternoon and seen it, and picked up a post-hole digger as naturally as if he belonged there. He was good with the cattle, easy and unhurried with them, and they accepted him the way cattle accept people who do not approach them with any anxiety. He ate supper with her at the house 3 nights running, the 2 of them at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the evening cooling outside, and the conversation never ran out and never became labored, and was, she thought, the best conversation she had had in years. On the 4th night he said he needed to leave the next morning for the Cimarron. She had known this was coming and had been managing her response to it in advance, which was her method with things she would rather not face directly. She had told herself that this was a man she had known for 8 days, that 8 days was nothing, that she had her land back and her case was nearly won, and she had everything she needed for the life she was building, and that longing for things that were going south with the cattle drive was a luxury she could not afford. She had believed approximately half of this by the time he said it. "I know," she said. "You mentioned the Cimarron." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. They were on the porch after supper, the evening blue and soft around them, the cattle quiet in the field. "I want to come back," he said, "when the drive is finished, about 6 weeks." She looked at the field rather than at him. "You do not have to say that." "I know I do not have to," he said. "I am saying it because it is true." He paused. "I have been thinking about what I told you, that I was still looking for the place I wanted to be." He turned toward her and she could feel it without looking. "I think I found some part of that answer this week." She looked at him then, because she was not a coward, and she would not stare at a field when a man she had been falling toward all week was saying something that required her full attention. "This is a hard piece of land," she said. "It needs work and it is a long way from anywhere comfortable, and the winters are genuinely unpleasant." "I have spent winters snowed into a line shack with a bad harmonica player," Ralph said. She nearly laughed. She pressed it back. "I am serious." "So am I," he said. He was, she could see that, entirely serious, with that steady quality he had that made serious things feel solid rather than heavy. "I'm not asking you for anything right now except for 6 weeks. Let me do this drive and come back and let's see what we have." He paused. "Is that a reasonable thing to ask?" She thought about Thomas again, and about the various other ways she had observed love being impractical and then failing, and about the fact that she had survived on her own and could continue to survive on her own, and did not need this to work out in order for her life to work out. And then she thought about the fence post he had set without being asked, and the way he had said the wrong people when she had worried about not being domestic enough, and the look on his face in the candlelight at the restaurant in San Marcos. 6 weeks, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He reached out slowly and carefully and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that had come loose in the evening breeze. Just that, nothing more, the lightest possible touch, gone as soon as it happened, but her whole awareness contracted to that point of contact and then expanded back out, and the evening seemed brighter somehow. 6 weeks, he said. He left the next morning before 8, with his saddlebag repacked and drum fresh from a day's rest, and she stood in front of her house and watched him ride south and told herself firmly that 6 weeks was not very long. The 6 weeks without Ralph Easton were simultaneously the busiest and the longest of Mabel's year. Busy because the legal process required her attention and her presence at Sutton's office multiple times a week, and because the cattle needed tending, and the fence she and Ralph had started needed finishing, and the east side of the roof had decided that now was the time to demonstrate the full scope of its deterioration, leaving her with a bucket in the bedroom during the first rain. Long because the kitchen table at supper was a kitchen table for one again, which it had been for 8 months, and which she had been perfectly accustomed to before he had sat across it from her, and now it was different in a way that was inconvenient to acknowledge. Drake's case fell apart in the 4th week. The territorial court issued its final ruling setting aside his claim, citing the federal land grant as controlling authority, and noting that the original filing had been in clear legal error. Drake's lawyer filed one final objection, which was denied within 3 days, and then it was over. 160 acres of grass land north of Caldwell, belonging to her father and now to her, and not to Harlan Drake, now or ever. Sutton delivered the final ruling to her on a Tuesday afternoon, and she held the paper in both hands at his desk and felt, for a moment, the full weight of everything that had gone into getting to this piece of paper, her father's years of work and his death and her 8 months of fighting, and the 2 days across the Kansas plain with 4 men behind her. And she held it until the weight became something she could carry, and then she folded it carefully and put it in her saddlebag with the other documents and rode home. She sat on her porch that evening as the sun went down, and she allowed herself to think, carefully and honestly, about Ralph Easton. She thought about how completely she trusted him, which was the foundation of it. She had not trusted easily or quickly in her life, and she trusted him in a way that had arrived without drama and without deliberate effort, simply been there from the moment on the ridge when he had said he was not chasing her. He was going the same direction. She thought about the 8 days he had been here and how present they still were in her mind, detailed and clear, the way days are when they have really been lived. She thought about the porch and the fence and the kitchen table, and the fact that in 6 weeks she had not met another person whose company she preferred to the memory of his. This was, she concluded, looking at the sunset, probably love. Probable love was a careful way to put it, but she was a careful woman and she was allowing herself to be honest. And the honest assessment was that she was either in love with Ralph Easton or very close to it, and had been moving in that direction since approximately the moment he had tilted his hat and said he was heading south. She wondered if he knew it. She thought he probably did. She thought that was probably why he had said 6 weeks instead of nothing. Ralph came back in 5 weeks and 3 days. He rode up the lane on Drum in the late afternoon of a Thursday with a small package tied to his saddlebag, and his hat pushed back on his head, and she was in the yard mending a piece of harness when she heard hoofbeats and looked up, and when she saw who it was, she set the harness down and stood up and watched him come down the lane. He dismounted and tied Drum to the post and came across the yard, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and they were both absolutely still for a moment, assessing the reality of each other after nearly 6 weeks of anticipation, and then she said, "You are 3 days early." "The drive finished early," he said. His eyes were moving over her face the way they had that first day on the ridge, taking inventory, and she let him because she was doing the same thing. "How is the roof?" She almost laughed. "Still leaking on the east side." "I can fix that," he said. "I know you can," she said. And then she crossed the distance between them 3 steps, and she did not make a production of it or hesitate or find something careful to say. She put her hand against his jaw where the traveling beard had come back in and looked at him directly from a foot away and said, "I am glad you came back early." He put his hand over hers, the one against his face, and held it there. "I was not going to wait the full 6 weeks if I could help it," he said. "I thought about you every day." "I thought about you every day as well," she said, because it was true and she was not going to be the kind of woman who pretended otherwise. "And I won the land case." His face broke into the smile, the full one that made him look younger, and before she could add anything else he leaned forward and kissed her, carefully and warmly, the kind of kiss that is asking a question and already knows the answer, and she kissed him back in the way that answered it completely. When they separated, he was still smiling, and she probably was too, which she would have found embarrassing under other circumstances, but these were not other circumstances. "What is in the package?" she asked. He looked down at himself, momentarily confused, then turned and retrieved it from Drum's saddlebag and held it out. It was wrapped in brown paper and about the size of a book. She took it and opened it. It was a book. It was the complete collected poems of Walt Whitman, which was a thing she had mentioned once, briefly, wanting and not being able to afford, and which he had remembered and carried back from wherever he had passed through on the drive. She looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remembered everything," he said simply. She kissed him again for that. He fixed the roof the following day, which required him to be up there for most of the morning while she handed up materials, and they talked across the gap between the ladder and the ground, and the result was a solid repair that she could tell by looking at it would hold for years. He did not make a ceremony of it or expect acknowledgement. He came down from the roof and washed his hands at the pump and said, "That should do it," and she said, "It will do it very well," and they had lunch. Over the days that followed, which were late summer days on the Kansas plain, golden and long and gradually cooling toward the first breath of fall, the question of what they were, and where this was going was present between them without being urgent, the way a good question waits to be answered in its own time. They rode together and worked together and talked in the evenings on the porch, and Ralph slept in the barn without being asked, which she appreciated for its respect, and also slightly resented for reasons she was not ready to examine in detail. It was on the porch one evening in the second week after his return, with the fall stars beginning to appear and the cattle settled and the day's work finished, that Ralph put down his coffee cup and turned to her and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly." She looked at him. He had the focused, serious expression that she had come to recognize as meaning something important was incoming. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, composing himself, and she could see that he was nervous in a way she had not seen before, a slight tension in his jaw, his hands very still. She found it unexpectedly endearing, this nervousness, because she knew he was not a nervous person, and the fact that she could make him one meant something. "I have been riding for 3 years," he said. "Looking for a place, I told you that. I found work and I found good country and I found decent people here and there, but I did not find anything that made me want to stop." He looked at her. "Until I met you. And I know that this is fast, and I know your life is here and it is complicated and it is yours, and I would never try to take any part of that from you. But I want to be here. I want to be here with you on this land, building what you are building and standing beside it and beside you." He paused. "What I am asking, Mabel, is whether you would be willing to let me stay, permanently, as your husband, if that is something you want. If it is not, I understand that too, and I will find a way to be nearby instead, but I am done going anywhere except here." She looked at him in the starlight for what was probably a long time, long enough that a less certain man might have filled it with talking, but he just waited, with that steadiness of his, which was itself part of the answer. She thought of everything she had considered on the porch 6 weeks ago, all the careful assessment of trust and company and the kitchen table for one, and it was all still true and more. "Yes," she said. He exhaled a long, slow breath, and the tension left his face and left him looking younger and lighter and entirely himself. "Yes," he said, as if confirming. "Yes," she said. "Ralph, I would very much like you to stay." She paused. "Permanently." He picked up her hand from the arm of the chair and held it between both of his, and they sat that way in the quiet evening, with the stars coming out and the cattle moving softly in the field, and it was the most contented she had been in longer than she could accurately measure. They were married in November, in the small church at the east end of Caldwell's Main Street, on a Saturday when the sky was high and cold and brilliantly blue. The minister was a straightforward man who did not make the ceremony longer than it needed to be, and Sutton was there as witness along with Mrs. Tanner, who had driven up from her ranch for the occasion, and wore an expression throughout the whole proceeding that might have been described as satisfied. There were perhaps 30 people in the church, because Mabel was not a woman with a large social circle and Ralph had only recently arrived in the county. But the ones who were there were the ones who mattered, and the ones who had known her father and who understood what the past year had meant, and who watched her walk to the front of that small church with something that looked, collectively, like relief and joy, and the particular warmth that communities feel when something goes right after a long stretch of things going wrong. Harlan Drake was not there. He had moved his operations south toward the territory line some months back, following a pattern Mabel had heard was common for him, absorbing losses by finding new territory to push into. She did not expect to see him again, and she found on her wedding day that she did not spend any of the day's warmth thinking about him. She spent it looking at Ralph, who was standing at the front of the church in a good jacket she had not seen before, clearly acquired for the occasion, with his hat in his hands because you do not wear a hat in church, and who looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that she understood was the way she looked at him when she was not managing her face. Absolutely gone on her. Completely and without reserve. She thought, looking back at him, that she understood the feeling entirely. The minister said the words, and they said the words back, and Ralph put a ring on her finger that was plain gold and fitted exactly right, and she put one on his. And when the minister said they were married, Ralph kissed her in the restrained way appropriate to a church, and then looked at her with a full smile, and she felt the happiness of it clear through her bones. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way Kansas winters were hard, which was deeply and seriously and without apology. The cold came in early December with its full strength, dropping temperatures to places that made outdoor work brutal and brief, and snow fell twice before Christmas in quantities that required them to dig paths from the house to the barn twice a day to keep the cattle alive. It was not a comfortable winter by any measure, but it was, Mabel thought, a good one. Ralph worked as hard as she did, which she had expected because she had observed him work and knew his quality, but the winter gave her a different kind of knowledge of him than the open country had. Winter knowledge was kitchen table knowledge, the kind that comes from being in close quarters through long dark days, from seeing a person tired and cold and short on patience, and finding out who they are when there is no room for performance. Ralph was, in winter, exactly who he was in summer. Patient with the cattle and with the weather and with himself and with her, handy with repairs in a way that saved them real money on a tight budget, capable of making her laugh on days when laughing seemed like an extravagance they could not afford. He read to her in the evenings from the Whitman book she had kept on the shelf above the kitchen hearth, his voice low and steady in the firelight, and she sat across from him with her mending, and listened to the words and the fire and the wind outside, and thought that this was what she had been working toward all her life without knowing exactly what it would look like. They got through the winter. Spring came with the drama that Kansas springs always brought, enormous and violent, and then suddenly glorious. The grass going from brown to green in what seemed like days, the cattle restless with the change in clover, put up in the barn since December, nearly insufferable in her impatience to be out on the open plain again. Ralph had kept his mail carrier work through the winter, taking routes when the weather allowed, and he had made enough at it to add a new animal to their small remuda, a young gray gelding that he was beginning to train with the same patient, unhurried method he applied to most things. He had talked to a rancher south of town about expanding their cattle operation and had gotten a good price on 6 additional longhorn crosses to add to the 32 Mabel had come into the marriage with. By spring they had 38 head, and the land was good, and the roof held through the snow and rain without incident. In March, Mabel told him she was going to have a baby. She told him in the kitchen in the morning over coffee, because she was not a woman who made great ceremonies out of information, and she had been waiting until she was sufficiently certain to say it aloud. And when she said it, she watched his face. He went very still for a moment, the way he did when something had reached him deeply, and then the stillness broke open into something she had never quite seen before on his face, a kind of unguarded joy that had no management in it at all. And he came around the table and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with that expression and said nothing for a long moment because apparently words were not immediately accessible. "Ralph," she said, quietly amused. "I know," he said. "I know, he shook his head. "I am very happy," he said. "That is a very inadequate thing to say for how happy I am." She put her hands over his. "It covers the general idea," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then said, "Are you all right? Do you need anything? What do we need to do?" "We need to do everything we have always been doing," she said. "I am not fragile, Ralph. I am having a baby, not becoming a different person." He looked at her and she could see him recalibrating, pulling back the impulse to wrap her in something, finding the appropriate version of the response. "Right," he said. "Of course," he paused. "But tell me if that changes." "You will be the first to know," she said. The baby came in November, a boy they named Thomas Wallace Easton, giving him her father's name as his first name, which Ralph had suggested, and which she had accepted with the gratitude she did not always know how to speak out loud. Thomas arrived on a cold, clear night with the help of Mrs. Lundqvist from town, who served as midwife to most of Caldwell County, and Ralph sat outside the bedroom door through all of it in a state that Mabel could hear in the occasional sounds he made, which were the sounds of a man exercising tremendous control over his instinct to come through the door. When Mrs. Lundqvist opened the door and said he could come in, the look on his face when he saw them, the boy and the exhausted and triumphant woman in the bed, was something Mabel knew she would carry for the rest of her life. He sat beside her and held the baby with great care and looked down at him with the same unguarded expression he had had on the morning she had told him, and he said, "He is extraordinary." "He looks like a very new person," Mabel said, practically. "He is extraordinary," Ralph repeated, not to be argued with on this point. She looked at the two of them, the man and the boy, and felt the happiness of it as a full physical thing, something that occupied her chest and her throat and pressed gently against the inside of her eyes. Thomas Wallace Easton was a good baby, and then a demanding toddler, and then a very energetic young child. And through all of it, the ranch continued to grow in the gradual way that honest work produces growth, not sudden or dramatic but steady and compounding. By 1885, they had 63 head of cattle on land that was legally and securely and entirely theirs, and Ralph had built on 2 rooms to the house, doing most of the work himself with some help from a neighboring rancher named Holloway who owed him a favor. Drake never came back. Sutton wrote them a letter in 1884 saying that Drake had been involved in a land dispute down in the territory that had not gone in his favor, and that he appeared to have shifted his interest further south and west, and that the Caldwell court had officially closed the file on the Wallace-Easton land grant, everything in order and permanently so. Mabel read this letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and picked up her coffee and said, "Good." Ralph, across the table, said, "Good." They left it at that because it did not require more. In the spring of 1886, Mabel told him there was going to be a second baby. He took this news with somewhat more composure than the first time, having had several years of practice at being a father, but the expression was the same underneath the composure, that unmanaged joy that she loved most in him because it was the truest version of him. "Another boy or a girl this time, do you think?" he asked. "I have no idea," she said. "Neither does anyone else, whatever they tell you." He laughed. "That is fair." The second baby was a girl born in September, and they named her Clara Me Easton, the me for no one in particular, but because it sat well with the Clara and Mabel had liked the sound of it. Clara was dark-haired like her father, and had Mabel's particular expression of assessment, the slightly narrowed eyes that meant she was watching everything and would have opinions about it shortly. Ralph looked at her the first time and said, "She is going to be trouble," which he meant entirely as a compliment. Thomas, who was 3 by the time Clara arrived, was solemnly interested in her in the way of small children who have been told a very important thing is coming, and are not entirely sure what to make of it now that it is here. He wanted to hold her the first day, and held her with the careful, exaggerated stillness of a child trying very hard to do something correctly, and Ralph stayed close with his hands ready without making it obvious. And the picture of the 3 of them together in the late afternoon light of the bedroom was the kind of picture that belongs to a person's most protected memories. On a clear autumn evening when Clara was 3 months old and Thomas was sleeping, and the cattle were settled and supper was done, Ralph and Mabel sat on the porch in the last of the light. The Kansas plains spread out before them in the way they always did in autumn, gold and amber, and enormous under a sky that was going to particular shade of purple-blue that only came at this time of year. Mabel was leaning slightly against him, his arm around her, both of them watching the light change. She had Clara in the crook of her other arm, the baby asleep and warm and smelling of that particular soft smell that new babies have, and the whole arrangement, the man and the woman and the sleeping child and the evening land, had the feeling of something fully arrived at. She thought about the morning 4 years ago when she had pulled Clover from the hitching post in front of the dry goods store and ridden south with Drake's men behind her. Thought about the 4 she had outrun before the 5th one sat still on a ridge and watched her with no calculation in his eyes. She thought about the creek crossing and the cottonwoods and the long grass in the late summer light, and a man riding parallel on a ridge line who had said he was not chasing her, he was going the same direction. She thought about how the right person was not the person who pursued you hardest, but the person who was simply going where you were going, and had the sense to let you go there yourself. "Ralph," she said. He said, in the drowsy, contented way of a man who has done a full day's work and is comfortable, "Do you remember what you said on the ridge, when we first met?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking back. "I said I was not chasing you," he said. "I was riding the same direction." "Yes," she said. "Why?" His arm tightened slightly around her. "I was just thinking about it," she said. "About how that was the right thing to say, how I would not have let you ride with me if you had said it any other way." "I know," he said. "I knew it then too." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, that steady, open look that was his particular way of seeing her, full and present and without anything held back. "Good thing you were going south," she said. "Best thing I ever did," he said. Clara shifted in her arm and made a small sound and settled again, and the evening light was still going its slow, spectacular way across the plains. And inside the house, they could hear Thomas talking in his sleep in the low, murmuring way that he did, whole conversations with people in his dreams, and the horses were quiet in the pasture, and the cattle were dark shapes moving slowly in the near field. Ralph kissed the top of her head, and she rested against him, and looked at the land that had been her father's, and was now hers and his together, every inch of it hard-won and all of it kept, and she felt the peace of it settle into her like something she had been carrying in her arms for a long time and had finally set down. In the morning, which would come with the particular clarity that followed these autumn evenings, there would be work to do. There was always work to do, fence lines and cattle, and the winter supplies to think about, and Clara to feed at dawn and Thomas to supervise through his breakfast, which he approached as an opportunity for chaos. There would be letters from Sutton confirming the year's legal standing, and letters from Ralph's sister in St. Louis, and the mail carrier's route that Ralph took twice a month still, for the pleasure of knowing the country and the extra income. There would be all of that, and it was good. All of it was good. But right now there was only the porch and the evening and the baby and the man with his arm around her, and the land going gold and amber to the far horizon. Mabel Wallace Easton closed her eyes and listened to the prairie evening, and it sounded like everything she had ever wanted, and it was.